With great power comes one exhausted kid by Avashhmava. Chapter 1. Tony Stark was many things: genius, billionaire, philanthropist, and, as he was slowly coming to realise, a reluctant but hopelessly attached mentor to one Peter Parker. Not that the kid made it easy. Peter was a hurricane of energy, all wide-eyed enthusiasm and unshakable optimism, a bundle of nerves wrapped in spandex who somehow managed to juggle calculus exams, robotics club and web-slinging patrols all in the same day. It was impressive, admirable even, but it was also exhausting to watch. Lately, Tony had been noticing the cracks. It started out small, Peter zoning out mid-conversation, taking longer to respond to texts, skipping out on Friday movie nights at the compound with the excuse of, "So much homework, Mr. Stark, you don't even understand." Tony did understand, actually. He'd been a workaholic since he could hold a screwdriver, but he also knew what burnout looked like, and Peter was walking straight into it. Tony Stark had never planned on being a mentor. He wasn't the type. The idea of some kid looking up to him, relying on him, it was terrifying. He could barely take care of himself, let alone guide someone else. But somehow, against all odds, Peter Parker had wormed his way in. The kid had that effect on people. At first, Tony had kept his distance, offering upgrades and missions, but nothing too personal. Peter had a life outside of all of this, and Tony wasn't about to disrupt it. But that life, school, friendships, Spider-Man, was a balancing act that even an enhanced teenager couldn't sustain forever. It was in the little things. Peter showing up to the compound later than usual, muttering something about traffic, even though he could swing here faster than most people could drive. The way his texts had started getting shorter, less animated. His usual long-winded, rambling messages reduced to clipped responses. "Mr. Stark, can't make it today. Studying. Sorry, got caught up with patrol. Next time. All good, don't worry about me." It wasn't bad exactly, but Tony knew better than to take things at face value. Peter was the type to downplay, to shrug things off like they didn't matter. It was what he did after Berlin, after Vulture, after the ferry incident. It was what he was doing now. So Tony paid attention. He started checking in more often, dropping by Queen's unannounced, watching Peter closely when he was at the compound. And the more he looked, the more obvious it became. Peter was exhausted. Not the stayed up too late playing video games kind of exhausted, the deep, bone-weary kind. And the worst part, he was good at hiding it. Too good. Tony could see the strain in the way Peter held himself, the way his smiles didn't quite reach his eyes, the way he swayed slightly when he thought no one was looking. But whenever Tony tried to bring it up, Peter just brushed it off. "I'm fine, Mr. Stark." That was his go-to line, always delivered with a too-easy grin, as if that made it true. Tony wanted to believe him, but he didn't. And he had a feeling it was only a matter of time before Peter's house of cards came crashing down. Peter was fine. He had to be. Sure, his eyelids felt like they were lined with lead, and sure, he couldn't remember the last time he slept a full 8 hours, but that didn't matter. Spider-Man didn't get tired. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. The truth? He was stretched too thin. Between school, patrols, decathlon practice, and his responsibilities at the compound, he barely had time to breathe. Every second of his day was accounted for. If he wasn't studying for a physics exam, he was stopping or mugging. If he wasn't in class, he was training with the Avengers. If he wasn't training, he was, well, crashing. Not that anyone knew. Peter had gotten good at pretending. He made sure to crack jokes, to smile, to keep up the endless energy everyone expected from him. As long as he paid the part, no one would question it. And he couldn't afford for them to question it, because if they did, they might tell him to slow down. And slowing down meant people got hurt. So he kept going, even when his hands shook from exhaustion, even when his head pounded from lack of sleep, even when his vision blurred just a little too often. He kept going, because that's what Spider-Man did. Peter had always been good at multitasking. His life had been a balancing act for as long as he could remember, juggling school, friendships, and being a superhero without letting anyone catch on. For the most part, he was proud of how well he managed it. He got decent grades, showed up to decathlon practices, kept up with his patrols, and still had time to joke around with Ned at lunch. But lately, that balance had started slipping. The first time he nodded off in class, he brushed it off as a one-time thing. It was during English, the teacher droning on about The Great Gatsby, and Peter had let his eyes close for just a second. Then suddenly he was being shaken awake, and Mr. Harrington was standing over him, looking half concerned and half annoyed. "Peter, if you find this discussion that boring, feel free to take a nap in the principal's office instead." There were a few chuckles from his classmates, but Peter forced a sheepish grin, rubbing his eyes as if he were just a little tired instead of completely wrecked. "Sorry, Mr. Harrington, long light studying." The excuse was easy enough. No one questioned it. But then it happened again. And again. By the end of the week, Peter had lost count of how many times his head had dropped onto his desk, only to snap up back in panic. His notes were a mess of half-written sentences, and his teachers had started calling on him more, probably to make sure he was still conscious. It wasn't just at school either. His patrols were suffering. His swings weren't as precise, his landings heavier. The city blurred past him in streaks of light and shadow, his mind lagging just a second behind his body. Twice he nearly miscalculated a web, and had to scramble to correct it before he went crashing into a rooftop. And then there were the headaches, dull, aching things that settled behind his eyes and never quite went away. He told himself it would get better. Once midterms were over, once decathlon regionals were out of the way, once he got a real night's sleep. But every time he tried to take a break, something came up. A stolen car, a fire, a high-tech weapons deal in a back alley. And if he wasn't on patrol, he was at the compound training with the Avengers, pushing himself harder to make up for his mistakes. It was a never-ending cycle, and it was catching up to him. Chapter 2. 3:07 a.m. Avengers compound. The compound was eerily quiet at night. Most of the team had turned in hours ago, leaving the halls empty, save for the occasional patrolling security bot. Peter knew he should have been asleep too, but his body wasn't cooperating. His limbs ached with exhaustion, his brain felt like mush, but when he lay in bed, sleep refused to come. So he wondered. Dressed in his Midtown Tech hoodie and a pair of old sweatpants, he padded barefoot through the dimly lit corridors, hands shoved in his pockets to keep from rubbing at his eyes. He wasn't even sure where he was going, just moving for the sake of moving, hoping the slow walk would tire him out enough to finally crash. He ended up in the kitchen, because of course he did. The compound's kitchen was a luxury compared to the tiny one in his apartment, stocked with everything from gourmet coffee to the weird protein shakes Thor swore by. "Couldn't sleep?" Peter nearly jumped out of his skin. He turned quickly, heartbeat spiking, only to find Steve Rogers standing in the doorway, arms crossed, looking way too awake for 3 a.m. He was in sweatpants and a long-sleeved Henley, probably up for one of his late-night runs. Peter forced a smile, even as his pulse pounded in his ears. Yeah, just needed some water." Steve didn't move. He studied Peter with that unnervingly perceptive gaze of his, the kind that saw through all the half-truths and deflections. "You look exhausted, kid." Peter shrugged, lifting a bottle of water from the fridge, like it somehow proved his point. "I'm fine." Steve gave a small hum, clearly not convinced. He stepped further into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. "How long has it been since you got a full night's sleep?" Peter hesitated. He knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt like admitting defeat. "I dunno. A while?" That was clearly the wrong answer. Steve exhaled, shaking his head. "Peter, pushing yourself this hard isn't sustainable. You need to rest." "I do rest," Peter argued, gripping the water bottle a little tighter. I've been busy. It's not a big deal." Steve frowned, crossing his arms again. "It is a big deal. We all have limits. Even you." Peter wanted to disagree, wanted to insist that he was fine, that he could handle it, but he didn't have the energy for another argument. Instead, he just sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll be okay, Cap. Really?" Steve didn't look satisfied, but after a long moment he nodded. "Go easy on yourself, Peter." Peter forced another smile, gave a half-hearted nod, and slipped out of the kitchen before Steve could press any further. By the time he got back to his room, his exhaustion was a living thing, pressing down on him like a weight. He climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling, but sleep still refused to come. And when Steve told Tony the next morning, Peter wasn't even surprised. A few days later, now Peter knew something was wrong. At first, it was easy enough to ignore. He was used to being tired, used to the constant ache in his muscles, the way his body never quite felt rested. That was just part of the job. But now, a week after that late-night run-in with Steve, he had a new problem. He couldn't eat. It wasn't that he refused to eat. He just didn't want to. Which didn't make any sense. His metabolism had always been ridiculously fast, burning through calories like wildfire. Normally, skipping a meal left him shaky and lightheaded, his body demanding fuel. But now, the thought of food made his stomach turn. The first time he noticed it was at school. He and Ned had been sitting at their usual lunch table, MJ flipping through a book across from them, while Ned rambled about his latest Lego project. Peter had his tray in front of him, some mystery meat sandwich, a pile of limp fries, an apple, but none of it seemed appealing. "Dude, you gonna eat that?" Ned asked, eyeing Peter's tray. Peter blinked, realising he'd been absent-mindedly pushing his food around for the past 10 minutes. Yeah, just not that hungry." MJ arched a brow without looking up. "You? Not hungry? That's new." Peter had forced a laugh, hoping they'd drop it. "Guess I had a big breakfast." It was a lie. He hadn't eaten that morning. Or the night before. And yet he wasn't craving anything. No hunger pangs, no gnawing emptiness in his stomach. Just an odd sense of indifference, like eating was something he should do rather than something he needed to do. By the end of the week it had gotten worse. His energy levels, already dangerously low, had plummeted. Walking upstairs left his legs weak. Running to catch the subway had his vision swimming. Patrol was a nightmare, his swings slower, his reflexes dulled, his body sluggish in a way that set his nerves on edge. He knew he should be concerned, but he didn't have the time. Between school, decathlon, patrols and training at the compound, there was always something else demanding his attention. He told himself he'd fix it later, that he just needed a good night's sleep, that it wasn't that bad. Then Tony found out. Avengers Compound, Friday night. The team had gathered for dinner, something they tried to do at least once a week. The kitchen was filled with the usual sounds. Nat and Clint arguing over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Sam making some joke at Bucky's expense. Thor enthusiastically recounting a battle story while gesturing wildly with his fork. Peter sat at the far end of the table, a plate in front of him, untouched. He wasn't trying to avoid eating. He'd even put food on his plate, making an effort to appear normal. But now, staring down at it, he felt nothing. No hunger, no interest, just a dull, leaden exhaustion that made even lifting his fork feel like too much effort. He didn't notice Tony watching him. Didn't notice the way the older man's eyes tracked every too small movement, every half-hearted attempt to push food around. Didn't notice until Tony set his own fork down and said, "All right, what's going on with you, kid?" Peter looked up, startled. "Huh?" Tony gestured towards his plate. "You've been sitting there for 20 minutes and you haven't taken a single bite. That's weird. You eat like a human garbage disposal." Peter swallowed, trying for a casual shrug. "Not really hungry." Tony's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not hungry?" Something in his tone made the rest of the table go quiet. Peter suddenly felt every pair of eyes on him. Steve's mild concern, Nat's unreadable gaze, Bruce's slight frown. He forced a laugh, even as his palms went clammy. "Geez, is it a crime not to be hungry? Maybe I just ate before I got here." Tony leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Except you didn't." Peter blinked. "What?" You didn't eat lunch. Or breakfast. Tony's voice was level, too calm, like he was waiting for Peter to dig himself into a deeper hole. You haven't eaten anything since that granola bar yesterday morning, and before you even try to deny it, Friday keeps track of your biometrics, so don't even think about lying to me. Peter's stomach twisted. He hadn't realised it had been that long. Now that Tony had said it, though, he could feel it, the way his limbs felt weak, the way his head felt lighter than it should, the way his fingers trembled slightly when they rested against the table. But before he could come up with an excuse, Tony sighed and leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. Kid, what the hell? Peter opened his mouth, closed it, then shrugged helplessly. I dunno, I just haven't really wanted to eat. Tony stared at him like that was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. You need to eat. Your metabolism isn't normal, Pete. You burn through energy faster than any of us. You can't just skip meals. I know, Peter said quickly, because he did know. But knowing and fixing it were two different things. It's not on purpose, I just... He hesitated, struggling to explain something he barely understood himself. I don't feel hungry, like, at all. That admission did something to Tony's expression. His usual snark faded, replaced by something quieter, something serious. How long has this been going on? Peter shifted uncomfortably. A week, maybe? Tony exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Jesus, Parker. Steve, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. This is what I was talking about, he said, looking at Tony. I saw him up at 3 a.m. last week. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Tony's jaw tightened. Because he hadn't. Peter squirmed under their combined scrutiny. Okay, can we not make this a big deal? Tony shot him a look. It is a big deal, kid. There was a long pause. Peter could feel the weight of the entire team's attention pressing down on him. Tony's eyes were locked onto his, unyielding, waiting for Peter to just accept what he was saying. But Peter couldn't. But Peter was already walking out, muscles taut with irritation. He heard Tony call his name again, but he didn't turn back, didn't stop. He just kept moving. Because, if he stayed, he wasn't sure what would come out of his mouth. And right now, he didn't have the energy to deal with the fallout. Tony sighed, rubbing a hand down his face as Peter stormed out of the kitchen. Well, Clint said, breaking the silence. That went well. Not now, Legolas, Tony muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. Steve, still watching the door Peter had disappeared through, crossed his arms. You realise he's not going to take this well, right? Oh, you think? Tony shot back, dropping his hands to the table. Kid's been running himself into the ground for weeks, and now he's acting like I'm the bad guy for pointing it out. Nat leaned back in her chair, tilting her head. Because, from his perspective, you are. Tony scowled. Excuse me? She gave him a pointed look. He's exhausted, Tony. You pushing him about it probably just made him feel worse. Tony exhaled sharply. He knew that. But what was he supposed to do? Just let Peter keep spiralling until he collapsed? Because if things kept going the way they were, that was exactly where this was headed. Bruce spoke up, his voice calmer than the others. His metabolism isn't like ours. If he keeps this up, his body is going to start shutting down on him. He glanced at the ceiling. Friday? Yes, sir? Pull Peter's vitals from the last 2 weeks. There was a brief pause before Friday's voice returned, softer this time. His glucose levels have been consistently low, and his overall energy output is higher than his caloric intake. If this continues, his body will enter a state of severe depletion. Tony's stomach twisted. He didn't need the AI to tell him what that meant. He'd seen it before, in other people, in himself. When the body ran out of fuel, it started pulling from whatever it could. Reserves that Peter didn't have. Steve sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. We need to be careful about how we handle this. Oh yeah? You got a strategy, Cap? Tony asked, crossing his arms. Steve hesitated. I just think pushing him too hard will make him more resistant. Tony huffed. Great. So what? We just sit back and hope he fixes it on his own? Nat shook her head. No, but we have to be smart about it. Tony exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He hated this, hated feeling like he was tiptoeing around something that shouldn't even be an issue. Peter needed to eat. He needed to rest. He needed to stop acting like he was fine when he clearly wasn't. And if he wasn't going to fix it, then Tony would just have to do it for him. Chapter 3. Peter hit the ground hard, pain flaring up his side as he barely managed to roll with the impact. His ears were ringing, his vision blurred at the edges. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he forced himself to push up on shaky arms, blinking against the pain that pelted down around him. The fight had been brutal. Some high-tech mercenary group had decided to cause havoc in the city, armed with weapons that looked way too advanced for street-level criminals. Peter had barely had time to breathe between dodging energy blasts, taking down reinforced exosuits, and trying not to get crushed under collapsing scaffolding. He'd won, obviously, but it had taken everything he had. And now, standing in the aftermath, bruised and exhausted, he knew he had a bigger problem. He was late. A flicker of panic cut through his haze in his mind. He forced himself upright, wincing at the sharp pull in his ribs. Training at the compound was non-negotiable. He'd already skipped one session this week, and Tony had made it clear he was watching Peter like a hawk. If he didn't show up again... No, not an option. His head felt too heavy as he fired a web at the nearest building, launching himself into the air. The rain blurred the city lights into a hazy glow, but he barely registered it. Every swing was a struggle, his grip faltering, his muscles trembling from overuse. By the time he reached the compound, he could barely land on his feet. His knees buckled slightly as he stumbled forward, dragging himself inside. His whole body ached, but he didn't stop. He limped down the hall, peeling off his mask with shaky fingers, feeling the sweat clinging to his skin despite the cold rain. His hands left damp streaks on the doorframe as he pushed into his room. Just 5 minutes. 5 minutes to breathe. He leaned against the wall, letting his eyes slip shut, just for a second, just long enough for the room to stop spinning. Then he pushed himself upright. Training. He had to go. His suit was soaked through, the fabric clinging uncomfortably, so he forced himself into dry clothes. His limbs felt like lead as he moved, every motion sluggish and uncoordinated. He caught sight of himself in the mirror and grimaced. His face was paler than usual, dark circles stark under his eyes, a faint tremor in his hands that he really hoped no one would notice. He took a deep breath, forcing his shoulders back, forcing some semblance of normalcy into his expression. Then he stepped out the door and made his way to the training room. Peter forced himself to walk normally as he entered the training room, willing his aching muscles to cooperate. Most of the Avengers were already there. Tony, Steve, Nat, Bucky and Sam, standing near the sparring mats mid-conversation. Peter's stomach twisted as he realised just how late he was. Tony turned at the sound of the door. His eyes immediately narrowed. "And look who finally decided to show up!" Peter swallowed. "Sorry, got caught up in something." His voice was hoarse, his throat dry. Tony gave him a once-over, and Peter knew he saw everything. His damp hair, the way he was slightly favouring his left side, the tension in his posture. But instead of commenting, Tony just exhaled sharply. "Fine, you're here now. Let's get started." Peter nodded, relief flickering through him. He just had to get through this. He could rest later. Steve stepped forward, taking control of the session. "We're working on endurance drills today. Everyone pair up." Peter felt his stomach drop. He barely had the energy to stand, let alone to spar. But he couldn't back out, not when he'd already given Tony enough reasons to be suspicious. Nat gestured for Peter to pair with her. His muscles screamed in protest, but he moved onto the mat, fists raised. The first few rounds weren't too bad, at least not outwardly. He dodged, countered, kept up with Nat's attacks. But every motion was sluggish. His reactions were slower than they should have been. His vision swam every time he moved too fast. He was messing up. He could feel it. Nat must have noticed too, because she suddenly hesitated mid-strike, giving him an opening, one she never would have given him normally. A test. Peter gritted his teeth and forced himself to counter, throwing a punch that barely had any strength behind it. Nat easily blocked it. Her expression shifted. Not pity, but concern. That was somehow worse. His heart pounded against his ribs, too fast, too loud. His skin felt clammy, his breath shallow. His legs trembled under him. He just had to hold out a little longer. Just a little... The room lurched. Peter barely registered the way the world tilted violently beneath him before his knees buckled. His body hit the mat hard. Somewhere in the background he heard someone say his name. Then everything faded. For a split second, no one moved. Then... Peter! Tony was already moving before he could think about it, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Peter was sprawled on the mat, his body unnaturally still, his breathing too shallow. Nat was kneeling beside him in an instant, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. "His pulse is weak," she said, her voice tense. "Kid, come on," Tony muttered, shaking Peter's shoulder. No response. A cold knot of panic tightened in his chest. Steve was already stepping forward. "We need to get him to medical." Tony didn't need to be told twice. He shoved his arms under Peter, lifting him effortlessly. The kid barely weighed anything. Too light. Too light. That wasn't normal. That wasn't okay. Tony barely registered the others as he strode out of the training room, moving on autopilot. Every step was too slow. Every second stretched unbearably. Friday's voice was already in his ear. "Vital signs are unstable. Blood sugar levels critically low." Tony swore under his breath. How had he let it get this bad? How had Peter let it get this bad? He pushed through the doors of the medbay, luring Peter onto one of the exam tables. Bruce was there within seconds, his face set in a grim frown as he immediately went to work. Tony stepped back, hands clenched into fists. His pulse pounded in his ears as he watched Bruce check Peter over, hook him up to an IV, monitor his vitals, do all the things Tony should have forced Peter to do days ago. "Is he going to be okay?" Clint's voice cut through the tension. Bruce exhaled. "He's severely dehydrated and his body's running on empty." He shot a look at Tony. "When's the last time he ate?" Tony's jaw tightened. He knew this was coming, knew what the answer was. "I don't know," he admitted. Silence. Bruce pressed his lips into a thin line. "That's not good." "Yeah, no kidding." Tony ran her hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "So, what do we do?" "Right now, IV fluids and rest." Bruce's voice was steady, calm. "Once he wakes up, we'll talk about why this happened." Tony swallowed, glancing at Peter's pale face. His brows were furrowed even in unconsciousness, like he was still fighting something. Because of course he is. Tony clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 4. Peter's eyelids fluttered open, the harsh white lights of the medbay blinding him for a moment. His head was heavy, a dull ache pulsing in his temples. His limbs felt like they were made of lead. It took him a second for him to remember where he was. The compound. The training room. Tony. Peter's breath caught. Tony was standing by the wall, arms crossed, watching him closely. The look on his face was hard to read. Anger, frustration, concern, all mixed together in a way Peter couldn't quite untangle. "Hey," Peter mumbled, his voice weak. "What happened?" "You collapsed," Tony said, his voice flat but thick with something Peter couldn't pinpoint. He stepped closer, hovering beside the bed. What the hell, kid? Peter opened his mouth to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper, so he closed it again. Instead, he tried to sit up, only to be met with a wave of dizziness. His body felt completely out of sorts. He hadn't felt like this since ever. "I'm fine," Peter croaked, reaching for the bed rail to steady himself. Tony wasn't having it. He grabbed Peter's shoulder, gently but firmly pushing him back down. "Don't even try to pull that crap with me. You're not fine." Peter's eyes darted away. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to admit that Tony was right, that he'd pushed himself too far. I'm fine now. It was just a little too much, I guess." "A little too much?" Tony's voice hardened, his jaw tightening. "You've been doing this for weeks, Peter. Skipping meals, getting hardly any sleep, pushing yourself harder than anyone should. And for what? So you can be a hero?" He took a sharp breath. "You're not a damn robot, kid. You need to eat. You need to rest. You need to take care of yourself or you won't be able to do any of this." Peter shifted uncomfortably under Tony's gaze. He didn't want to admit it, but Tony was right. He was running on empty. His body felt like it was giving up on him, and yet he still couldn't stop. I don't know what to do anymore," Peter muttered, his voice breaking slightly. "There's always something, you know? The crime in the city, the decathlon, school. Everyone needs me. And I can't let anyone down." Tony's expression softened. He sighed, sitting down on the edge of the bed, his tone shifting. "Kid, listen. You don't have to do everything alone." Peter bit his lip, blinking back the sudden lump in his throat. "I know, but it's hard not to." Tony leaned forward, placing a hand on Peter's knee. "I get it, but that's what I'm here for. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. I'm not going to let you." Peter swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking in. He'd never really let himself rely on anyone, especially not Tony. But right now, hearing him say that was like a lifeline in a sea of exhaustion. "I'm sorry," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to worry you. I didn't know how to stop." Tony's face softened. He reached up, brushing his hand through Peter's hair. "You don't have to apologise, kid. But I'm not letting you push yourself like that again. We'll figure this out, okay?" Peter nodded, the exhaustion finally starting to weigh on him in a different way. He wanted to fight it, to push through, but he couldn't anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. After that conversation, things seemed to settle into a new routine, at least for Peter, but it was a routine he wasn't thrilled about. Tony was determined. "You're staying here longer," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to take it easy for the next few days. No more solo patrols. You're going to sleep, eat, and let me keep an eye on you. End of story." Peter opened his mouth to protest, but Tony cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm serious, kid. This isn't a request. I'm not letting you burn yourself out. If I have to drag you kicking and screaming, you're staying put." It wasn't that Peter didn't want to stay at the compound. He just hated feeling like he was being treated like a kid. But the way Tony said it, so matter-of-fact, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, Peter couldn't argue with him. So, for the next few days, Peter stayed at the compound. Tony kept him busy with light work, research, helping out in the lab when he could, and a lot of just sitting. He didn't like it, but it did feel kind of nice, in a way, having Tony around all the time, checking in on him, making sure he was actually eating. One evening, after dinner, Tony found Peter sitting on the couch in the common room, half leaning against a cushion. He was holding a book, but his eyes were glazed over, clearly not focusing on the page. "Hey, you're doing that thing again," Tony said, walking over to him. Peter didn't even look up. "What thing?" The thing where you look like you're alive, but you're really a walking zombie, Tony smirked, taking the book from Peter's hands and tossing it onto the table. Peter groaned, rubbing his eyes. I'm fine, Tony, just tired. I'm aware, Tony replied dryly. That's why you're going to get some sleep and not make me call Bruce in here to knock you out with something. Peter rolled his eyes but allowed Tony to pull him up. The soft pressure of Tony's hand on his back as they walked towards the hallway was oddly comforting. They stopped in front of Peter's room and Tony gave him a pointed look. I'll check on you later. You've got a strict curfew, kid. Got it? Peter's lips twitched in amusement. Yes, sir. Tony raised an eyebrow, looking down at Peter with a mixture of amusement and something warmer in his gaze. Good. Peter blinked, his tired mind catching up with the situation. This wasn't normal. It wasn't like he had a dad or anything. He couldn't remember the last time he'd needed a dad. But with Tony, there was something about the way he cared for him, the way he was always looking out for him, that made Peter want to trust him with everything. He didn't know how to explain it, and honestly, it scared him a little. But right now, he was too tired to overthink it. Good night, Tony, Peter said quietly, stepping into his room. Tony's eyes softened, but before they could say anything, Peter closed the door behind him. Later that night, Peter had managed to actually get some rest, his body completely drained. But sleep had come in a way that felt too light, almost too restless. He hadn't heard the soft knock on his door. Tony opened it, poking his head inside. Just checking in, he said in his usual casual tone. You doing okay? Peter rubbed his eyes, then smiled tiredly. Yeah, just really out of it. Tony chuckled. I bet. Well, I'll let you sleep, but if you need anything, I'm right down the hall. Peter gave a small nod. Thanks, Tony. Tony smiled, starting to leave. Sleep well, kid. Peter let out a contented sigh, turning over in bed, still processing the strange feeling in his chest. It was like Tony had become more than just a mentor or a friend. And as he settled in, tired but somehow comforted, he whispered, almost too quietly to hear, Good night, Dad. It wasn't until he heard the door click shut that Peter realised what he'd just said. He froze, his eyes shot wide open. Did I just say that? His heart skipped a beat. No, no, no. He quickly sat up, feeling his face flush as the realisation hit. He had never called anyone Dad before, not even Uncle Ben, and certainly not Tony Stark. But it was out there now. And somewhere down the hall, Tony paused, a surprised soft chuckle slipping from his lips as he leaned back against the doorframe, a strange warmth settling in his chest. Tony wasn't sure how long he stood there after Peter's slip-up, his hand still on the doorframe. A mix of emotions surged through him, surprise, warmth, and something else he couldn't quite name. But as the seconds passed, and he heard Peter's nervous shifting on the other side of the door, something clicked into place. Peter had never known what it was like to have a father. His real father had been, well, gone before Peter could even form proper memories. Tony had never thought of himself in that way. He wasn't Peter's dad. He was his mentor, his friend, his almost older brother. But hearing Peter say it, even if it was an accident, felt like a shift. A shift that felt right. Tony swallowed, leaning forward, pressing his forehead against the door for a moment. He exhaled slowly. It had been years since he'd let someone get close to him like this, since he'd allowed someone to depend on him in a way that demanded real, no-strings-attached care. But now he could see it clearly. He wasn't just a mentor to Peter anymore. He was something more. Peter needed him, and Tony couldn't walk away from that. He wouldn't. Tony pushed off the door and stepped quietly down the hall, his mind racing. When he reached his lab, he saw Friday's display light up on the console. "Tony?" she asked, her voice soft, yet laced with curiosity. "Yeah, Friday?" he replied, not looking up. "I've analysed the data you requested on Peter's vitals and stress levels," she said, her voice steady but concerned. "It seems the issue with his health is more severe than originally thought. His body is running on the edge of depletion. He has a high metabolism, but it's been severely taxed recently. If this continues, it could lead to permanent physical damage." Tony felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't needed to hear that. He already knew it. "Thanks, Friday," Tony muttered, his eyes scanning the information, then closing the console with a frustrated sigh. Then, as if on autopilot, he made his way to his office. He had a lot of things to process. The next morning, Peter woke up to the sound of gentle knocking on his door. He wasn't sure if he was still dreaming or not, but when he opened his eyes, the sun was just starting to rise. The door opened a crack, and there stood Tony. Peter swallowed, his throat still dry from the night before. The rush of embarrassment hit him again. He had said it. Dad. Tony didn't acknowledge it immediately, but Peter could see the small, almost imperceptible grin on his face as Tony stepped inside. "I brought you breakfast," Tony said, placing a tray on the desk beside Peter's bed. Peter blinked at the food, surprised at how normal it looked. Bacon, eggs, toast, and a glass of orange juice, just like Aunt May used to make on lazy Sunday mornings. He swallowed, trying to calm his racing heart. Thanks." Tony watched him closely, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a bit too serious for just a casual breakfast delivery. Peter shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "Tony, about last night." Tony cut him off, a hand raised. "Don't worry about it, kid. We'll talk later." Peter froze. "We will?" Tony smiled. "Yeah, we will." Peter's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what that meant yet, but in a way, it felt like the start of something new. Something good. Days passed and Tony kept his promise. He stayed close, kept an eye on Peter, and didn't let him slip back into his old habits of overworking himself. Peter resisted at first. He didn't like the idea of being coddled, but eventually he began to relax, slowly. One afternoon, they were sitting in lab together. Peter was helping Tony with some small repairs on one of his suits, and for once, Peter was actually enjoying the work. He wasn't thinking about crime or school or Decathlon. He wasn't thinking about how much his body hurt. He was simply here, with Tony. "I think we're done for the day," Tony said, pushing his chair back from the workbench and looking over at Peter. "You're free to do whatever you want. Just take it easy, all right?" Peter smiled, a genuine smile. "I will, promise." Tony nodded, clearly satisfied, before standing up. "Good. You're doing better, kid. Just don't push it again. You need to take care of yourself or you won't be able to do any of this." Peter rolled his eyes, but his grin never faded. "Yeah, I got it." Then, without thinking, he added, "Thanks, Dad." Tony froze in his tracks. Peter's eyes went wide and he immediately turned a shade of red deeper than any spider suit. I didn't mean to, sorry, Tony's expression softened, and without a word, he walked back over to Peter, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yeah," Tony said, his voice quieter than usual. "I think you did." Peter stared up at him, unsure of what to say, but when he saw Tony smile, something clicked inside of him. Maybe it was accidental. Maybe it was a slip of the tongue. But in that moment, Peter realised that it was okay. And Tony, well, Tony wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed. Have a lovely rest of your day.